Today's daf we're going to be learning is Menachot daf Yubet. Today's daf is sponsored by Sarah Galasco in loving memory of her father, Bernard Wayman, Yehuda Dov ben Yosef Dvora, on his first yotzei. A dedicated daf learner, missing you and wishing you were still with us on your lifelong daf journey. Okay, before we start, I just want to mention that we went already to the Menachot workshop this past week, and we're going again on Monday in Hebrew, so if anybody didn't join and wants to join the Hebrew group, there's still a few spaces available, so let us know, and you can register and join. Okay, if you don't know how, just reach out to us, info@hadron.org.il, and we'll get back to you. Okay, we're going to get started with our daf. So, it probably pays to start back at the beginning of the Mishna. We're getting back into the laws of pigul, and also when we get to the Gemara, we're going to go back to this first line, so probably worthwhile to go read it inside, which is, the Mishnah starts off with, and we're going to have the whole slew of Mishnayot, just like we had in Zvachim, about pigul. Okay? I'm not going to delve into pigul as much now, because we dealt with it a lot in the past. Obviously, we're going to delve into it as much as the Gemara does, and you'll see some of the sugya, particularly tomorrow's sugya, where it starts at the end of today's daf, is completely parallel to the one we saw in Zvachim, which is good review. But again, pigul is a thought, right? The thought, generally we assume it's the Kohen, although there's a bit of a machlok, is it the Kohen or the owners of the korban, who has this thought while they're doing one of the main actions, we're going to see that today, that it's going to be eaten outside of the time frame. And again, that's all derived from this pasuk in Vayikra, which really doesn't, the simple reading doesn't seem to be that. And again, if you want to delve into that, I mentioned Din and Daf went up yesterday specifically on this topic, much more in depth into pigul. So now and what exactly the rabbis did and how they got from that pasuk, which seemed to be talking about an action and turned it into thought. Okay, that we talked about a lot in Zvachim as well. So the Mishnah starts off, a kemitza tamincha, basically it's the same parallel to hashochet et korban, right? The pigul kemitza, we said many times, is like the pigul shchita of slaughtering. I will mention, by the way, just because for tomorrow's daf, there's a study guide. Anyway, it's really on today's daf, but I put it really in tomorrow because it's really just the very end of today's daf, and we're not going to deal with it very much, but it's really on tomorrow's daf, so you can use the study guide there for tomorrow. You can even look at it today. Okay. If you take, while you're taking the komets out, remember you're taking the handful out, we dealt with that a lot yesterday, and while you're doing it, the Kohen's doing it, he has this thought that he's going to eat the shirayim b'chutz or kazayit mishirayim b'chutz. We didn't really focus on this kazayit, but today we're going to focus on it. Okay, so he's going to eat the remainder of it, or only an olive bulk of the remainder of it. Okay, even if it's just an olive bulk, since that's a shear of achila, right? That's eating. So that's a problem. But it's b'chutz. His thought is, I'm going to eat it outside the Azara, which he's not allowed to do. He has to eat it inside. Lahaktir, remember the courtyard, the temple courtyard, because it's kodesh kodeshim. Or his thought is lahaktir kumtza b'chutz, or he's going to burn a kazayit of it outside, o kazayit mikumtza b'chutz, or a kazayit of the komets outside, o lahaktir levonata b'chutz, or his thought is to burn the levona outside, the frankincense, pasul ve'embo karet. This is all disqualified. However, it's not karet. Why does it not carry with it the sin of karet? Okay, first of all, what would carry the sin of karet? Okay, don't get confused. This we've talked about a lot in Zvachim, and it's a general misconception. It's not pigul. You don't get karet if you think that thought. Okay, which, by the way, again, I'll mention, there's a machloket between many, but let's say the Rambam on one hand, who says thought means really just in your thoughts, and Rashi says you actually have to express it for it to be a problem, for it to be effective. But anyway, the karet is on the person who eats it. Karet is if you eat the pigul item, which in this case would be the remainder. In the case of the animal, it was the meat of that korban that was supposed to be eaten, and now it became pigul, you're not allowed to eat it. If you were to eat that meat, or in this case, eat the shirayim, you would get karet for eating it. Okay, it's an isur achila completely of eating it, not the person who messed it up. The person who messed it up doesn't get a punishment here of karet. Okay, now in this case, there is no karet. Why is there no karet? Because again, what did I tell you? The pasuk where we learn pigul from is all about specifically beyond its time, not outside of the place. So outside of the place becomes a disqualification because there's a drasha on it, but you don't get karet for it. But if you do the same exact things, or all those same things we just said, but tomorrow, outside of its time, that's pigul v'chayavim alav karet. That's the classic case of pigul. Now, zehaklal, here's the rule. Now, the reason they have to say this is because in the first part, all they said was hakometz. When you do the kemitza. Now we're talking about kol hakometz v'notem b'kli v'molich v'maktir. It's not just the kometz when you're doing the pula of taking the kometz out, but even the putting it in the kli, if you have a thought then, or your molich, you're carrying it to the mizbech, or your maktir, you're burning it on the mizbech, and while you do that, you have a thought. Le'echol davar shedarko le'echol. You think I'm going to eat something that is normally eaten, meaning I'm going to eat the remainder, or laktir davar shedarko laktir, or you have a thought about burning something that normally is burnt, meaning I'm going to burn the kometz beyond the given time. Notice it's very clear here that you're only going to have a pigul issue if your thought is about eating something that normally is eaten, or it's supposed to be eaten, or burning something that's supposed to be burned, and not the reverse. Okay, we're going to come back to that at the end of daf today. Chutz limkomo. Now, if your thought is you do any one of those 4 actions with a thought that you're either going to eat or burn something beyond their designated space, in the wrong space, we already know what they're going to say. Pasul ve'ein karet, right? It's disqualified without karet. Chutz lizmano, if you do any of those, again, it's like 8 options because you have 4 actions with either a thought about eating or a thought about burning. Then you do a chutz lizmano and you say, I'm going to eat it or burn it in the wrong time. Pigul v'chayavim alav karet. Okay, that's pigul and you're going to have karet. You could have stopped here, but they add one more important thing. In order for it to be pigul, though, there needs to be one more thing, which is going to lead us to the whole next section of our Mishnah. But you have to actually sacrifice the matir. What's a matir? Talked about this a lot. The thing that permits something else. What's the matir in our case? The burning of the kometz and the burning of the lavona, right? As long as you do the rest of it the way it's supposed to be done. If you don't burn that kometz the way it's supposed to be done, then it's not pigul. Remember, we use this word a lot in Zvachim about it's miratzeh pigulo. This action creates that it's going to be pigul. Everything else has to be done properly. Now, we're going to see exactly what this means. It's going to be a little more expanded than I just said. Ketzad karev matir kemitzvato. In case you didn't really understand this, what does it mean? What it really means is not just that you have to be makru. It means all the actions of this kometz, right? So all the actions of taking the kometz, putting in the kli, doing, right, taking it to the altar and burning it on the altar, all have to be done completely properly, other than you did one or multiple of them with a thought that you're doing it outside of time. But if any one of them is done in a way that disqualifies it for some other reason, then it's not pigul, because it has to be, the disqualification is specifically because of your pigul thought. Okay, and this is completely parallel to the Mishnah we saw in Zvachim, if it sounds familiar. So, kamatz b'shtika. Let's say you were silent, meaning you had no thought at all when you did kemitza, so you didn't do anything wrong. Natan b'kli v'holech v'iktir chutz lizmano. And then in all the other 3 actions, they're just going to give different possibilities. In all the other 3 actions, you thought, I'm going to bring this outside of the right time frame, right? Tomorrow. Osha kamatz chutz lizmano. Or you started off, the kemitza was done with a pigul thought, and then natan b'kli v'holech v'iktir, and all 3 other ones were done b'shtika. Okay, these are just possibilities. There's obviously multiple possibilities because there's 4 actions, right? So there could be a lot of things that were done right now, okay? But basically, everything else other than your pigul thought was done properly. And your pigul thought could have been in multiple actions. Okay, now they're giving other ones. You could have done all of them pigul. This is, again, we used this once before. I don't remember if it was in this case or not, but this comparison to the game set. Right? Either everything's right? Or everything right is obviously fine. Everything's wrong, or one is wrong and the others are right. Okay, so there has to be there's different combinations that work and different combinations that won't work. We'll see. Zeu shekarev amatir kemitzvato. But, ketzad lo karev amatir kemitzvato. So when is this not going to work? Kamatz chutz limkomo, natan beklivo, lich v'iktir chutz lizmano. So you took a kemitza, chutz limkomo. When you did the kemitza, you thought, I'm going to burn this outside the temple courtyard. And then, when you did natan b'kli v'olich v'iktir chutz lizmano, then you did all the other actions with a pigul thought of outside of time. Well, those are 2 different disqualifications. Then, it's going to be disqualified, but there's no pigul here. Okay, it's definitely bad, Okay, I'm sorry, there's no, right, it's not called pigul, it's called pasul, disqualified. But what does it mean it's not pigul? There's no karet. If you eat it, you're not going to get karet, which is a very severe punishment. Oh, another case of not karet, kemitza. You did the kemitza with the thought. Now, what we're pointing out here is it doesn't matter the order. It doesn't matter if you started with the one that wasn't pigul, which is outside of time, the space. What if you started with outside of time and then moved to outside of space? So kamatz chutz zmano, and then natam b'klivo lifviktir. You did the other three chutzlin komo. Okay, and again, it doesn't matter the numbers of how many. O shekamatz v'natam b'kli. You did all four outside of the space, which again, that obviously is going to be pasul without karet, because that's classic chutzlin komo. Okay, this is not pigul, so therefore it's not going to be considered that it was karev the matir the way it was supposed to, and therefore, right, because it was done with the thought to do it outside, that was not to do it outside of time. Now we're going to have another case, and again, this is completely parallel to what we saw in Zvachim. What if you did one of them? Shelo lishma. Okay, you disqualified it because of lo lishma. What case do we have to look for where the korban is disqualified lo lishma? Only the mincha chote or the mincha of the sota, the mincha knaot, because those are the only two that are completely disqualified if you did them shelo lishma, meaning you thought you took a mincha chote or mincha knaot, shekmatzan shelo lishman. While you were doing the kometz, you took the kometz out and you said, I'm doing this for the sake of a korban minchat nisachim or some other korban mincha. And then, so you're already disqualified because of that. And then natam b'klivo lichviktir chutzim zmano. And then you had a thought of chutzim zmano outside of time for the other three actions. Or, like we said before, it doesn't matter the order. You could have started shekamatz chutzim zmano. The kemitza was done with the pigul thought. And then natam b'klivo lichviktir shelo lishman. And then you did it shelo lishma after. Oh, shekamatz v'natam b'klivo lichviktir shelo lishman. You did all four shelo lishman. Okay, that wasn't obviously done properly because it's a disqualified korban, okay? But it's not pigul. Okay, now we talk about some other combinations. What if you combine, you say not in different actions of the four actions, but you're in one action and your thought is about eating an olive bulk of part of the shirayim, the remainder, bachutz, I'm going to eat an olive bulk of it outside, which combines with your thought, you're having the same thought at the same time, right? I'm going to eat an olive bulk of it outside, and I'm going to eat an olive bulk kazayit lemachal. I'm going to eat an olive bulk tomorrow. So that's, again, chutzim kamon, chutzim zmano combination. It's just a different combination than we saw before. That's also lo karev amatir kemitza, because you're combining two different disqualifications, and each one is a whole olive bulk, right? So you end up with a shear of this, a shear of that, but again, you're disqualifying it for some other reasons, so it's not going to be pigul. It's disqualified. Or kazayit lemachar, kazayit bachutz. Again, it doesn't matter the order, whether you started with the kazayit outside of time and then moved to outside of space. Kechatzi zayit bachutz, kechatzi zayit lemachal. Okay, or even half a zayit bachutz and half a zayit machar. Now, here's a big chiddush. Half an olive bulk is not enough. But you actually can combine half an olive bulk of out of time and half an olive bulk of out of space to disqualify, not to make it pigul. Obviously, it can't be pigul because you don't even have a whole kesayit thought of outside of time, right? Tomorrow, which even when you have, right, when you have a whole olive bulk of this and a whole olive bulk of that, anyway, it's not going to be pigul. So of course, you only have half an olive bulk of outside of time. Of course, it's not going to be pigul, but it is disqualified. These two half zaytim, because they're both really similar, they're both really learned from the same pasul, this chutzim komon, chutzim mano. So we're going to say they combine to actually disqualify the offering. You could have thought maybe they don't, so that's the chiddush of this line. Chatzi zayit bachutz, chatzi zayit lemachar, or chatzi zayit lemachar, chatzi zayit bachutz. It doesn't matter the order. Pasul ve'ein bo karet. So all the cases we just mentioned, again, it's disqualified, but there's no karet because we don't call this pigul really, okay, or not the pigul that we're talking about. Right? Sometimes chutzim komo is called pigul. It's a little confusing. They kind of call it pigul, but it's not really pigul. It's more like disqualified, just not the pigul that has karet with it. Now, I'm a Rabbi Yehuda. Zehakla. Rabbi Yehuda comes and disagrees, and you might remember him from Zvachim. If not, it's fine. We're going to review him. He says, he disagrees with one point that we mentioned in this Mishna. Tanakama said, it doesn't matter the order, right? As long as there's some other disqualification going on, it's not karet. It's not what we call pigul. But he says, no, it really depends which came first. Im machshevet hazman kadma lemachshevet hamakom. If first you had the pigul thought and you disqualified it initially, the initial disqualification, which is obviously the more important one because that's the one that caused this to be a disqualified offering, was chutz lizmano, was outside of time, then that's pigul, v'chayavim alav karet, and you get karet for it. But in machshevet hamakom kadma lemachshevet hazman, but if first you started with a different disqualification, like time, or it could be lishma, okay, shalo lishma, and then you moved into the pigul thought of zman, pasul ve'en bo karet. Okay, then it's just regular disqualified, no karet. The chachamim omrim, okay, we're going to have to get back to this in the Gemara as we did in Zvachim, the rabbis say zev v'zeh pasul ve'en bo karet. Okay, the truth is, I don't even think the Gemara gets back to this, but there was a whole sugya in Zvachim about this. How did the rabbis exactly disagree with Tanakam? Okay, because the rabbis are basically saying both are pasul and there's no karet. It sounds exactly like Tanakama there. So there you have to go back to Zvachim and see how they explained it there. Okay, now the Gemara is going to get off. It's a little bit of a complicated sugya. We're back to having sugyot with complicated girsas and different ways of reading it. So, okay, just to forewarn you. So if your commentary says something different, don't get confused by it. I think that's like one of the most confusing things here, that we just end up with, like you might be reading something and I'm saying something else, and that just happens. But okay, bear with me. So Abaye, we have a question. Okay, there's a lot of requisite knowledge you need to know here, but we're going to, as they're mentioning things, we're going to review them. Mostly things we've seen at different points. Abaye. So they ask the following question. Okay, now we're kind of leaving our Mishnah. We're going into a question that has to do with pigul, okay, but peripherally. Eventually, we're going to use our Mishnah and a bright of Rabbi Hiyya on our Mishnah, like his set of Mishnayot that was on our Mishnah, or maybe not. We're going to talk about that. It's going to actually be an interesting discussion about the what happened at the time of the Tanaim, like what was going on there and what people were writing their own books of Mishnah. Like we have our Mishnah, which is Rabbi Huna and put together, right? He edited it. Then there was Rabbi Hiyya, who edited his own set of Mishnah. So today we're going to see a bit of a debate about when Rabbi Hiyya put together his own book of Mishnah, was he kind of connecting with and agreeing with Rabbi, just writing things a little differently? Or could we say it was completely independent of the writing of the Mishnah, which is really interesting because it's really about, okay, it's going to be a complicated sugya, so I'm trying to show you something that's really fascinating that's behind this sugya, which is, what's our approach to the editing, like how central was the Mishnah in that time? Was it that was the basic book, and anyone who was writing, or particularly Rabbi Hiyya, who was related, who was the nephew of Rabbi, so, was he kind of sticking with Rabbi, and that was the central book, and he was working around it? Or was he just writing his own, editing his own book of Mishnah, having no connection necessarily to Rabbi? So that's kind of in the background here of what we're going to see. So here's a question. Okay, and like I said, right now, forget our Mishnah, we're going to go into this question. And this actually connects back to a sugya we saw a few dapim ago, which is, okay, I believe it would, daf tet. L'divrei ha'omer, according to the one who says, and this we saw in daf tet, shirayim shechasru ben kemitza haktara. Okay, remember we talked about if you're missing part of it. So all of a sudden, right, we lost some of the shirayim. At what stage? Well, we talked about different stages. So if it's between the time you did the kemitza, the whole dough is there, and then after the kemitza, we have the remainder left in the bowl, which now basically, as soon as we burn the komets, the handful, on the altar, that's going to permit the shirayim to be eaten by the kohanim, and where only in the azara they can eat it, because it's kodesh kodeshim. But before we burnt it, which is the matir, okay, this is why it's going to end up connecting with our Mishnah, we were talking about the matir and all that, because it's the matir, it permits the shirayim. Well, maybe the shirayim have to be complete before we burn it. Okay, so there was this machloket, can you still burn the kemitza? Once you're missing the shirayim, in the sense we're done with the shirayim, right? It's just the remainder. On the other hand, we haven't done the mitzvah yet. So, according to the one who says that if you lost some of the shirayim, right, someone came and ate them, they fell on the floor, they got lost, someone, disappeared, and we ended up somehow with just a kazayat left. Maktir kometz alehen. Okay, as long as you have a kazayat, one of the opinions is, you can burn the komets anyway. But we learned there, but you can't eat the shirayim. Okay? You can do the burning of the incense, of the komets. Sorry, I keep accidentally saying that. You can burn the komets, the handful, which means what? you can fulfill your obligation of this mincha. Okay, if you can't burn the komets, you can't fulfill your obligation. You can fulfill your obligation, but you can't eat those remainder. Okay, you can't eat that, the kohen. Can't eat it, because they got ruined before you did the komets. Now, here comes the question. That wasn't a question. That was just a given. If you hold this way, here comes a question. Okay, that's stage one of the question. It's really one and the same, but it's two different issues. Now that burning of the komets, of the handful, allows you, right, to say you fulfilled your mincha. But does it allow, now, and it doesn't allow the shirayim to be eaten. But now the question is, maybe it allows something of the shirayim. Maybe. Okay, so question number one is it effective to say, now what did we say here? As it's going to be pigul if yakriv hamatir kemitzvato. Now, was this done kemitzvato? Well, yes and no. It was done kemitzvato because we were allowed to burn it. On the other hand, we were missing shirayim and we're not allowed to eat the shirayim. So let's say there was a pigul machshava at some stage, would the burning kind of conclude it and say, okay, this is pigul and you're going to get karet if you eat it. Now, you can't eat the shirayim anyway, but you don't get karet for eating them. We just said they're forbidden to eat. But what if you eat them, are you getting karet because it's pigul? Okay, again, there would have to have been a pigul machshava earlier. How effective, what they really want to know is, how effective is this burning? The burning is definitely effective to have you fulfill your obligation of the mincha. It's definitely not effective to permit the shirayim. But now we have these in-between questions. So number one, is it called effective enough that now if there was a pigul machshava earlier, we're going to say, well, everything else was done the way it was supposed to be done. It's tricky because it wasn't really done the way it was supposed to be done. But on the other hand, it sort of was because you fulfilled your obligation. Number two, normally in a regular, let's say, sacrifice, okay, we're going to compare this in a minute, sacrifice, so it pays to already compare it. The burning of the komets is like the sprinkling of the blood. And the sprinkling of the blood in a korban and the burning of the komets in a mincha permits the meat to be eaten and the mincha to be eaten, right? The shirayim. They are what we call matirs. Now, in the case where they're not matir it, because either the meat's disqualified for some other reason, or the shirayim here got disqualified because they were missing before you did the burning. So normally it removes what we call isur meila. This all is kodesh until the kodesh prohibition is removed. So if you accidentally use it for something, right, there's meila. Once you do the sprinkling of the blood and the burning, there's no meila on it in a regular case. But since you can't eat these shirayim anyway, the question is, does this burning have anything to do with these shirayim anymore? Does it remove the prohibition of meila? So basically, they're kind of both asking the same question. Both questions are really one and the same. How effective is this burning for other things, right? Not so far as to say you can eat the shirayim, but maybe if you used it by accident for something else, would you, right? You took the dough and covered something with it. I don't know, like used it as a plastered on a cover or something. You used it for something else. Would you violate meila? Or if there was a pigul machshava earlier, would it say, you did that haktara, you burnt it, it's pigul now? So that's the question. We're going to have two approaches here, and they're going to be based on another machloket that we need to understand about zrika. And that's why I said we're going to compare it to a korban. And zrika in a case of yotzei. Okay? Now, what if you have a korban, and you sprinkle the blood, even though the meat got taken outside? Remember, we're talking about, right, the meat can't be taken outside, even in kochim kalim, until you do the zrika. The zrika kind of permits it, remember, otherwise there's meila, and you can't even take it outside. So if you took the meat outside before you did the zrika, does the zrika permit the isser of meila off that meat, even though the meat was outside already? Okay, again, the meat's disqualified, you can't eat it, but does it have isser meila? It's really the same question. It's just that one is chisaron, it's missing something, and one is, right, it went outside. So that's going to be the question. Are these really similar or not? And each person, Rav Huna and Rava, are going to have completely different approaches to this. So they're each going to compare and say it's not really the same, and they're each going to bring a different view of the machloket in the zrika case. So we'll see it all inside now. I'm a Rav Huna. Afilu Rabbi Akiva, even Rabbi Akiva, who in the case of zrika, of the meat, amar zrika mo'elet liyotzei. Now mo'elet, don't be confused. Mo'elet sounds like meila. Mo'elet means it's effective, meaning it's effective to remove the meila in a case of yotzei. So Rabbi Akiva is lenient in the zrika case. He says, if I sprinkle the blood on an animal that went outside, okay, meaning it went outside before I sprinkled the blood, it's going to remove the meila prohibition. So if somebody used that animal for something else, it wouldn't be prohibited. It wouldn't have the prohibition of meila on them. Hani mila yotzei, but that's only yotzei. So Rabbi Akiva, who permits it in a yotzei case, that's because the ite be'ene upasa machmata baracherhu. That meat is really no different than the meat was before you took it out, right? The meat is the same meat. It's just you happen to take it out, okay? It's not what we call a pasul in the goof of the animal. It's a pasul that comes from somewhere else. It's in the wrong location right now. That's much less than chisaron. Aval chisaron, if you lost the shirayim and all you have is a karet of the shirayim, you've ruined the shirayim themselves. Tipsula de gufehu. That's a disqualification in the goof itself. So even Rabbi Akiva is lenient in the yotzei case, is not going to be lenient here. Lo mahanyale haktara is going to say, haktara doesn't remove meila in our case. Okay, very simply. Rava is going to say the exact opposite. Amarle Rava. Rava says to Rav Huna and Rava, what do you mean? It's the exact reverse. And I'm going to go the other extreme. I'm going to say, afilu Rabbi Eliezer, because Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva had this debate about zrika in a yotzei case. Even Rabbi Eliezer, who's strict in the yotzei case, is going to be lenient here and say, damar ein zrika moela yotzei, hani mila yotzei. What's worse about a yotzei? Delete bifnim. It's not even inside the temple courtyard anymore. It's not even here. We're going to say, I sprinkled the blood here, right? It left the sanctified area. It's gone, okay? It's like a goner, right? My zrika has no effect, or the Kohen's zrika has no effect on this anymore because it's completely outside. But in our case, what's the case? It's missing shirayim, right? They got lost. But what's left, right? The leftovers is still here in the temple, right? It's in the temple courtyard. So, aval chisaron, the ite bifnim, it's still inside. Mahanyale haktara. So when I burn that, which I'm allowed to do, right, it's going to affect what's still right here. Okay, so he's lenient in this case. And again, each one says, even according to the one who's lenient, he's going to be strict here. Even the one who's strict there is going to be lenient here. Okay. I'm a Rava. Mina. So now comes the big thing. Where's my proof? Okay, it's a little bit complicated. This is the complicated part. There's different ways of reading this. It says the following. Ditznan. It says in our Mishna, Hakomitz et mincha le'echol shiyareha b'chutz o kezayit mishiyareha b'chutz. Okay, if you're komitz the mincha to eat, the remainder, here comes the key line, or a kezayit of the remainder, outside. V'tani Rabbi Hiyya. Now, when Rabbi Hiyya took this Mishnah, now again, Rava's view is Rabbi Hiyya is with our Mishnah completely, but he removed the words. When you see Rabbi Hiyya's Braita, he has the exact same words as the Mishnah without the words O Kezayit. He removes them completely. Now, the question is going to be, why does he remove them, and what does that show about our Mishnah? And even Rabbi Hiyya agrees with our Mishnah about that, but remove them for some side reason. Excuse me one second. Okay, so here goes. Tani Rabbi Hiyya. So he says, Hakomitz et mincha v'lo tane o kezayit. He doesn't have those words o kezayit. My time a lo tane o kezayit. Why did he remove them? Right, it's very fascinating. You can learn. This is a great way to learn something. You compare the same text. Somebody took out the words, right? The, obvious to Rava that he obviously saw Rebbe, took out the words, but the exact same thing, just without those two words. Lav kegon shachasku shirayim kamalu akazayit. Now, what's the case of o kazayit? Why would you say or kazayit? So either it's because you're only thinking about a kazayit of the shirayim, or it could simply be because that's all that's left, right? You know, do you have a thought of kemitza mincha? Then I'm going to eat the shirayim, or maybe a kazayit, because maybe that's all that's going to be left, because we're going to lose the shirayim before I burn them. Okay? So that's basically our case, right? Where the shirayim get lost. So he's basically saying that's already kind of referencing the shirayim could get lost. Now, keva, now here's the issue. There's the first part of the Mishnah. Okay, this is very important. That's why I started with what we did yesterday. Because we started with the kemitza mincha, lechol shirayim b'chutz and all that. And then we get to this klal. In the beginning, they were just talking about the part when you did the kemitza. Then they get to, this is the klal. If you're kometz, noten b'kli, molich maktir, to eat davar sh'takol echol, ulehaktir davar sh'takol aktir. Okay, notice in the beginning, it just talked it right. It talked about eating the shirayim, then it said about burning the kometz. But then at the end here, it talks about not just the kometz, also after the kemitza. Okay, you had a thought that when you're putting it in the kli, when you're walking it, when you're burning it, to eat something or to burn something. Now, we're assuming if kazayit is in that part, kazayit would be here. Now, it didn't say kazayit here in this part. But the assumption is that if it says kazayit in the reisha, it's going to be kazayit here too. Now, if it's kazayit here too, that means you have to kind of finish reading it. If you're komet something and you put bakli and you do all those things to eat a kazayit of something that you could eat, or to burn a kazayit of something that you're supposed to burn. Now, here comes the tricky part. Because kevan de b'matan kli b'hiluch u'b'haktara lo ma'ne le'o kazayit. Okay, turning now to Abaye, and here I'm going to change the girsa a little bit. Okay, not me, but going based on some commentaries. So listen. When you get to matan kli and hiluch and haktara, those three later ones, not the komets, but those three later ones, you can't put o kazayit. Okay? What we're basically going to say, and I'll explain in a minute why not. But, and get rid of the next few words, shirayim, kemitza, nami lecho, just have the word kemitza. Okay? O kazayit, kemitza. Okay, now, what basically, before we understand how this works, but what we want to say is like this. Rabbi Hiyya didn't want to put kazayit in the reisha because it doesn't make sense to put kazayit in this line. And if you read the Mishna, now, you probably weren't thinking about it, but what he's trying to say is if you read the Mishna and it was kazayit there, you would assume it's kazayit further on. Now, not like Rebbe thought it was, he didn't, but he says it's confusing. I'd rather just get rid of kazayit because it doesn't make sense in the later part of the Mishnah. So when I write my Mishnah in the school of Rebbe, I'm going to write it in a way that I think is more clear and more truthful. Not like Rebbe wasn't truthful, but he said, since kazayit appears there, people might think that kazayit would be true later, and it's just not. Why not? Okay, so now, because of that, lo tani o kazayit. Now here, the ikar is missing. Why this is, and that's why there's different commentaries on this. But basically, I'm going to go with this the approach that the issue is this. When you have a thought to burn a part of the komets, okay, if you're missing and all you have is, now, the problem is, before you could have a kometz of a kazayit of the shirayim and it would be fine. But a kometz, okay, there's a Mishna on Daf Kaf Zayin, let me just read it and then you'll see it inside explicitly. On Daf Kaf Zayin Amud Aleph, the Mishna says, at the very top of the Daf, hakometz miuto ma'akevet rubo. Okay? Which basically means if you don't have the whole kometz, okay, if you're missing, Rashi says there, im chisar koshehu pasul. You can't burn a kometz if you don't have the whole kometz. Okay, now you might be able to burn the kometz when you're missing the shirayim, but that's because that's not the part you're burning. But if you're missing any little part of the kometz, it's disqualified. So that whole part about while I'm doing the noten bekli molich maktir le'echol davar sh'dorkol le'echol ulaktir davar sh'dorkol aktil, and o kazayit doesn't fit there. Now, it's not like Rebbe thought it fit there, but the point being that he said, I'm getting rid of kazayit in the beginning, so you don't think that if you have a pigul thought, you can't have a pigul thought about something, you have to have a pigul thought about something that could be, right? Now, if you had a pigul thought about about burning less than a kazayit, that's not a davar harva way to burn. It has to be something that's way to burn. The whole kometz, I could have a thing, I'm going to do it outside of its time frame. So because it didn't fit there, he said, I'm going to take it out in the beginning. Okay, so what does this teach us? Well now, what are we looking for? Now remember what we assumed that this case, because it said, now this is all saying that it really does belong in the beginning. It just doesn't belong in the later part, and that's what Rabbi Hiyya said, I'm just going to get rid of it entirely so it doesn't confuse people. But he agreed with what Rabbi said. Now, what did Rabbi say in the first line? O kizayit m'shirayim b'chutz, v'katani seifa pigul v'chayavim alei karet. Now, even in the case where you end up with not the komets, but noten bekli, to eat a kazayit of the shirayim tomorrow, right? That's going to be pigul. Even though, like he said, this could be a case where there were no, right? You lost all the shirayim except for kazayit. And then what does that show? It's pigul. And you get karet for it. So what do you see? Because what he's saying is his part about le'echol, davar sh'dorkol le'echol, that would be or kazayit. Just the lahaktir, davar sh'dorkol lahaktir isn't kazayit. But le'echol would be kazayit. Le'echol, only kazayit the shirayim, because that's all you have. And it was missing after the kemitza, before you did one of these actions. So, what do you see? Alma mahan yalu haktara. that the burning of it when you're missing parts basically proves to you that, right, it's pigul, even though it's not going to permit the shirayim to be eaten. But we still view that burning as if it was a complete burning for the purposes of pigul, and then it would go hand in hand with, and then it removes the meila prohibition, which was question number 2. Okay, there's a bunch of jumps here to make, as you can see. It's not the most convincing argument, because who's to say it's talking about a case where your thought was about a kezayit because that's all that was left. You could have just had a thought about a kezayit. There's a bunch of jumps here, but that's his basic proof. Comes Abaye and says, Amarle Abaye lo. And this is what's interesting, because Abaye has a completely different approach. Rava's approach was that Rabbi Hiyya was with Rebbe in terms of what Rebbe said in his Mishna. He just said, there's something a little confusing about your version. I'm going to just take out those words so I don't confuse people about later on in the Mishna. But Abaye says to him, no, you're completely wrong. Rabbi Hiyya, it wasn't like he took Rebbe's Mishna and said, I'm going to go with this and just, edit it a little. He had a completely different approach. Hamane, Rabbi Elazar. Now we're going to leave our topic completely, because he's going to say the reason you took out kezayit had to do with something completely different, which is what? Okay, this is also a review because we learned this, but you might not remember it all. End of Zvachim, Daf Kuftet, Titnan, Hakomet, Vahalvona, Vahaktoret, Umchat Kohanim, Umchat Kohen Mashiach, Umchat Nesachim. These are all things that are completely burnt. The important one for our purpose is obviously the komet. The komet, which is completely burnt. The lavona, which is completely burnt, right? The frankincense. The ktoret, the incense, which is completely burnt. These unique menachot that are completely burnt. Sheikriv me'echat mehem bachutz chayav. Okay, if you burn them outside, I skipped the important word. Sheikriv me'echat mehem kezayit bachutz. If you just took a kezayit of them, and you burn just an olive bulk of them, now they're supposed to be burned completely, just an olive bulk of them burning outside, you're also obligated, even though theoretically, you're not really supposed to be obligated. This is all in the laws of what you're obligated for burning outside the temple, right? So, if you just take an olive bulk, even though you're supposed to burn the whole thing, and you burn it outside, you're liable. Rabbi Elazar potir ad she'ikriv kulo. Rabbi Elazar the Tana, okay, he's not the Amor Rabbi Elazar that we see a lot. Rabbi Elazar the Tana says, no, you're not obligated, and this is where Rabbi Hiyya went with. You're not obligated for burning something outside the temple unless you burn, if it's supposed to be burnt entirely inside, you have to burn the whole thing outside. If you just burn a kezayit, you're not obligated. So what does he say? Why did Rebbe get rid of this in our Mishnah? Rabbi Hiyya? Rabbi Hiyya didn't get rid of it in our Mishnah. He just doesn't mention kezayit at all because he doesn't think that kezayit, you're not obligated on burning a kezayit of the komets outside the temple because it's Rabbi Elazar who says you're not. So, if you're not obligated for burning it outside, then you're obviously not obligated for a thought that I'm going to burn it outside. And that's why he removes kezayit from the Mishnah entirely. Because it's not even disqualified if you had a thought like that. Forget about it, it's not pigul because it's kutzum komo, but it's not even disqualified at all. So it wouldn't fit in the Mishnah. So that's why he got rid of kezayit. So that's a completely different reason. Okay? And then it teaches you nothing about what you were trying to teach. Okay? So now he says, now it's a little tricky because what do you mean? The eating of the shirayim, he could have put the kezayit. So he just says very simply, Kevan de baktarat kemitza lo ma'ne leo kezayit mikum tzabachutz b'shirayim nami lo ma'ne leo kezayit. And then once it didn't belong in the burning part, well then he just took it out for the eating part as well. Not really because it could have been there, but he just took it out because once it wasn't there, he just didn't put it there. So now they ask a side question on Abaye. So Abaye basically rejects Rava's proof and says you could explain that Rabbi Hiyya, again, it's a completely different approach to what Rabbi Hiyya's relationship was to the Mishna of Rabbi Huna and Rava, which again is more interesting from the bigger, broader picture of how things worked in that time and when they were editing these texts. But for our purposes, they say, wait a minute, Abaye, how do you read it that way? Kevan de Rabbi Elazar, hai laktir kumtza ulevonata mibayle. Wait a minute. You wouldn't be chayav on a machshava pigul just on the kemitza. You'd have to have a machshava pigul on burning the kemitza and the levona together if you're Rabbi Elazar, because that's a different there's another opinion of Rabbi Elazar where he says, Ditnan, hakometz v'alevona sheklivet echad mehem bachutz chayav. Another Mishnah, he says, in Zvachim Daf Kuf Yud, he says, kometz and levona, that if you do just one of them outside, you're not obligated because right? There's em faglim v'chatzimatir, right? And this is only half of the issue. So if you burned only half of them outside, then obviously also if you're not going to be obligated on chutz if you only did one, then you're not going to be obligated on pigul unless your thought is about both. So this wording in the Mishna doesn't fit, because the wording would have to be laktir, the kometz, and the levona. It doesn't mention the levona anywhere here. To which so the kometz and levona shekri v'chamayim b'chutz, you're actually chayav. I was explaining the wrong line. You're actually obligated according to Tanakama. Rabbi Elazar poter ad shekri v'shnehem. He says you're not liable for outside until you burn both of them. So that doesn't match. To which we say, no, you could still read Rabbi Elazar. Why? When was he talking about just the kometz and not the levona? Obviously, he was talking about a case where there is no levona. What's that? When again, we're talking about Rabbi Hiyya. When Rabbi Hiyya put together his Mishna and worded it according to Rabbi Elazar, he was specifically talking about, that's number one issue, was the issue of he got rid of the kazayit to match it with Rabbi Elazar. And he wanted to match it with Rabbi Elazar even in the case of the mincha, or particularly in the case of the mincha, and that's why he mentioned if it's even just a pigul thought on the kemitza alone, well, that will be pigul in a case where, right, again, where you burnt the whole thing and not just the kazayit. Your thought was about burning the whole thing and not just the kazayit. And you didn't need the levona in your thought to call it pigul or to call it pasul, disqualified, because it was a case where there is no levona, there's no frankincense. To which the Gemara says, what they're going to take, the Tana, Rabbi Hiyya is going to take this time to do all this just for one mincha out of all the other menachot? In. V'chein ki'ata Rav Dimi, Amar Rabbi Elazar, and Rabbi Dimi came and said in the name of Rabbi Elazar the Amora, kometz diminished chotehu, the Rabbi Elazar he. Okay, this is talking about the mincha of the mincha chote, the kometz of the mincha chote, and it's all according to Rabbi Elazar. Okay, that's how Abaye rejects it, and the Gemara says, well, we had some questions on Abaye. Okay, it's all sorted. Now, just to complicate things a little more thing, Haktara Rava in the end though changes his mind. Now remember Rava against Rav Huna. Let's try to remember because it's a little confusing daf today. Rav Huna said in the beginning that zrika for yotzei, really yotzei is the topic, yotzei is actually much less bad than chisaron, missing a part. Missing a part is much worse because it's pasul digufi. Rava said the reverse. Missing is not so bad because it's still inside. But after this whole thing, Rava changes his mind. Haktara Rava, he in the end says, Lav milti da'amrei, fine, I take back what I said. Not necessarily because Abaye rejected his proof, but because he finds some other source that seems to go against Titania. It's about the lechem apanim, and it says, Kodesh Kodeshim hi. Lechem apanim is high-level sanctity. And what do they learn from this? She'im nifrasa achat mechaloteha kulam psulot. If one of them broke, this goes back to the we saw about them breaking, you can't eat any of them. Okay, we saw that before, right? What do we see? You can still burn the bizichei levona, but you can't eat any of them. Ha yatzat. Now, what can you infer from here? Just nifrasa. But what if it went out? Now, here we're going to compare. Nifrasa. Now, nifrasa is broken, which is like chisaron. Okay, we're making all these comparisons. It's like missing. Okay, breaking is like missing. But yatzat, hanidika gavai kshirot. But it sounds like, what if one of the loaves went out? Okay, well, sounds like you can eat the rest because it didn't say that here. It just said broke. So once he makes that assumption, he says, okay, well, let's think about who this goes according to. Now, what does that mean? It means when you burn the bizichei levona, it permits the rest of the loaves, just not the one that went outside. But when it breaks, right, it doesn't permit any of them. Now, you'd have to say this goes according to Rabbi Akiva, who says that zrika works for yotzei, and that's why, in this case, exactly, right? Same thing. The burning of the levona helps for a disqualification of going outside. But what does it say here? Kamer nifrasalo. So what do you see here? Even Rabbi Akiva, who permits it in the case of yotzei, doesn't permit it in the case of chisaron. And that ends up working like Rav Huna. So he basically changes his mind. And interestingly enough, although maybe not surprising, Abaye comes and questions that as well. So he did like when Rava said one way, and now he doesn't like when Rava said the other way. Abaye is classic devil's advocate here. He says, that's a really bad proof. Mikatane hayatzat, where'd you come up with this inference? Well, it says broken, they're all disqualified, but you added, if it went out, it wouldn't be, you can eat the rest of them. Maybe it made to infer, broken, it's a problem, but if it became impure, it would be okay. Now, why would impurity be any different? My time at the seats, because the seats atones for tum in the mikdash. So if one got tamei, well, if you burn the bezichin, you'd be allowed to eat the rest. Aval yatzat lo. But also, yatzat would be no different than nifrasa. They'll both be forbidden, right? They both are going to say. Now, who would this be according to? This would have to be according to Rabbi Eliezer. Remember, Rabbi Eliezer says, Zrika doesn't help. The burning of the bezichay levona won't help the disqualification of going outside. Now, bedinu dibayla lemit nami yatzat. So it should have said also nifrasa and yatzat. Now, why didn't it say it? Well, why is katani nifrasa hakamash? Well, the reason why it said specifically nifrasa was it wanted to tell you afilu nifrasa diite bifnim, that you might have thought because it broke, but it's still inside. Maybe you can actually eat the right lo mahanilu haktara. They want you to know burning doesn't help it, even though it's still inside. About Rabbi Akiva, but then he comes and adds, but if you're Rabbi Akiva who says Rika moelet liyotzei afilu chisaranami mahanilu haktara, but maybe he would think that if. But according to Rabbi Hiyya, who allows Zrika, this source isn't according to Rabbi Hiyya. According to Rabbi Hiyya, who allows it, maybe he allows Zrika and yotzei, and maybe there's no difference, okay? And therefore, maybe yotzei is the same, right? If he allows yotzei, maybe he'll allow broken. And if he allows broken, he'll allow chisaron. And then that goes against what Rava tried to say the second time. So, in the end, Abaye seems to reject everything Rava says, and we're left with difficulties. Okay, starting with the next Mishna, we're really going to do most of the sugya and tomorrow stuff, but we're going to start it. Okay, it starts off kind of simple because the Mishnah says now, sounds pretty simple and straightforward, but the Gemara is going to very much complicate it, and we're going to go to a complete sugya that we saw already in Zvachim. So, if you have a thought to eat a chatzi zayit and burn a chatzi zayit, okay, now, we're assuming it means eat a chatzi zayit of something you can eat and burn a chatzi zayit of something you can burn, okay? It's kasher. There's nothing wrong with this korban because your thought about achila and burning, those are two different actions, they don't combine. Okay, very simple. But the Gemara makes an inference. Whether this inference is true or not, that's going to be a whole discussion. But right now, they make an inference. The reason why you can't combine it is because your thought was about an action of eating and an action of burning, right? But But it sounds like, and that's going to completely contradict where we started off today, what if you have a thought of eating, let's say the shirayim, which are meant to be eaten, a chatzi zayit, and eating a chatzi zayit of the komets, which is not meant to be eaten, it sounds like they would combine, because only eating and burning won't combine, but eating and eating, similar, right? One that could be eaten and one that could be burned would combine. Now that completely contradicts haktani reisha. The previous Mishnah says, lechol davar sh'darko lechol laktir, davar sh'darko laktir. It sounds like it's only if you have a thought about eating something that you eat and burning something that you burn. Only eating of something that you eat would be a problem. Eating of something you burn wouldn't be a problem, and the inference seems to imply you could combine them. To which we'll see Rabbi Yirmiya's answer. We'll start with Abaye tomorrow. Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah, Hamane, Rabbi Eliezer he. Ta'amar mechashvina me'achilat adam l'achilat mizbeach u'me'achilat mizbeach l'achilat adam. He simply says, this Mishnah doesn't fit with the previous Mishnah because it's a different opinion. It's Rabbi Eliezer's opinion, which is going to come up later, which we saw in Zvachim, okay, where he says, Rabbi Eliezer says, you can actually combine thoughts of achilat adam and achilat mizbeach, okay? The fact that if you say, I'm going to eat something that's actually supposed to be eaten on the altar, that actually, you can combine those two thoughts, okay? Ditnan, how we're going to see it in a Mishnah, okay? It's actually just in, one sec. No, it's also in Menachot. That matches our Mishnah. You're komitza mincha with the thought you're going to eat something that is normally eaten and burn something that's normally, eat something that's not normally eaten and burn something that's not normally burned. It's kasher. But Rabbi Eliezer, pasul. Okay, so there's Rabbi Eliezer's approach, and we're just going to say this Mishnah is Rabbi Eliezer. Okay, with that, we're going to end for today, and we're going to pick up with this next class. So what do we have here? It's a bit of a long daf, but tomorrow's daf is actually very short, so you gain on that. So we have this idea about we had all the laws of pigul, and you need to karev matir kemitza, and everything else needs to be right for it to be called pigul. And then we led into this big question, which we took a lot of time on, is if you say shirayim that are missing after the time of the komets, before the time of the burning, they don't get permitted to eat, but maybe when you burn them, right, if you say you burn them, which is that opinion, according to the one who says you can burn them, is that burning effective for other things? For pigul, is it effective to remove the meila prohibition? And for that, we had two different approaches, although in the end, Rava ends up conceding to Rav Huna, and we had his attempt to prove it, Abaye's rejection of it, his attempt then to say why he switched his opinion, and Abaye's rejection of that, and then we moved into the next Mishna and how that contradicted the previous. With that, we finish for today. Wishing everyone a Shabbat Shalom.